Katie Morgan pressed her back against the cold brick wall of the alley and tried to catch her breath as the rain soaked through her thin jacket and into her clothes beneath, and she could feel the water running down her spine in rivulets that made her shiver, but she barely noticed anymore because she had been cold for so long that it felt normal now. 3 days had passed since her last real meal, and the teaching position at the international school had fallen through at the last minute, because they found someone with more experience and better credentials, and all the money she had saved to come to Tokyo was gone now, spent on the tiny apartment she could barely afford, and the visa fees, and the hope that had turned out to be worthless. Her stomach cramped again, and Katie wrapped her arms around herself and thought about the single packet of instant ramen sitting on the counter in her apartment just 2 floors up, and she had been saving it for tomorrow morning because she knew she could not make it another full day without eating something. But tonight was proving harder than she expected. The rain fell harder, and Katie pushed away from the wall and started walking toward the rusty fire escape that led up to her window because the front door required going through the main building. And she did not want to see her landlord, who had already started asking questions about next month's rent. That was when she heard it, and the sound cut through the drumming of rain and the distant traffic noise, and it was a whimper so faint and desperate that Katie stopped mid-step and turned her head, trying to locate the source. At first she saw nothing except shadows and puddles, and the overflowing dumpster that smelled like rot even in the rain. But then something moved near the corner where the alley bent, and Katie found herself walking toward it, even though every practical thought in her head screamed that she should go inside and eat her ramen and forget whatever was making that sound. The creature was huddled against the wall, partially hidden behind a stack of broken pallets, and at first, Katie thought it was a cat, or maybe a small dog, but as she got closer, she realized it was neither of those things, and her breath caught in her throat. It looked like something from a fantasy movie with scales that shimmered in colors she could not quite name, even in the poor light from the street lamp, and its body was roughly the size of a house. Cat, but the proportions were all wrong, with a long tail and wings that were folded against its sides, except one wing hung at an angle that made Katie wince because she knew that was not natural. The creature's head lifted as she approached, and its eyes locked onto hers, and they were amber-colored and slitted like a reptile. But there was something in that gaze that was not animal at all, and Katie felt her heart skip, because those eyes held intelligence and pain, and a desperate kind of hope. She should have run, and she knew that because this was clearly not a normal animal and it might be dangerous, and she had no idea what it was or where it came from. But instead, Katie found herself kneeling in the cold puddle next to the creature and reaching out slowly with one hand. The creature did not move away and up close. Katie could see the damage more clearly, and there was a deep gash along its side that oozed something that looked darker than blood, and its scales were dull in patches where they should have been bright, and it trembled constantly, either from cold or shock or both. Katie pulled off her jacket without thinking about the fact that she would be even colder without it, and draped it over the creature, which made a soft clicking sound that might have been gratitude. And she realized she had just made a decision that her rational mind would question for weeks to come. Getting the creature up, the fire escape was harder than Katie expected because it was heavier than it looked, and every time she shifted it, the creature made sounds of pain that cut through her. But finally, they made it through her window and into the tiny studio apartment that barely had room for her mattress on the floor, and the hot plate she used for cooking. Katie laid the creature on her only towel, which was already damp from this morning's shower. And then she stood up and looked at the packet of instant ramen sitting on the counter, and felt her stomach clench, with hunger so intense it almost made her dizzy. The creature made that clicking sound again and turned its amber eyes toward her, and Katie saw her own desperation reflected back, and something inside her chest cracked open like an egg. She filled her small pot with water and set it on the hot plate and waited for it to boil while the creature watched her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. And when the water was ready, Katie opened the packet of ramen, and the smell hit her so hard, she almost cried because her body recognized food and screamed for it. But instead of eating, she poured the hot water over the noodles and waited the required 3 minutes, and then she set the bowl on the floor next to the creature and watched as it pulled itself forward with visible effort and began to eat. The creature ate like it was starving, which Katie understood completely, because she was starving too, and she sat on the edge of her mattress and watched, and tried not to think about the fact that she had just given away her last food to something she did not understand and could not explain. When the bowl was empty, the creature looked up at her again and made a sound that was almost like a purr, and then it closed its eyes, and its breathing became deeper and more regular, and Katie realized it had fallen asleep. She sat there for a long time in her cold apartment watching the creature sleep and listening to the rain against the window and wondering what she had just done and whether she would regret it and whether she would even survive the next few days without food. But despite everything, Katie felt something she had not felt in months, and it took her a while to recognize it as purpose, because for the first time since arriving in Tokyo, she had done something that mattered and helped someone or something that needed help more than she did. The rain continued outside, and Katie pulled her thin blanket around her shoulders and lay down on the mattress, next to the towel where the creature slept, and she closed her eyes and tried not to think about how hungry she was. Tomorrow she would figure out what to do next, and tomorrow she would find a way to get food for both of them, and tomorrow she would deal with the impossible situation she had created. But tonight she had kept something alive that would have died, and somehow that felt like enough. The creature's breathing was steady and warm in the darkness, and Katie let that sound lull her toward sleep. And just before she drifted off, she felt something brush against her hand and realized the creature had moved closer and was pressed against her side, sharing what little warmth it had. Katie's last thought before sleep took her was that maybe kindness was not a luxury she could not afford, but rather the only thing that made being this poor and desperate and alone bearable, and maybe that was enough reason to keep going. Katie woke to sunlight streaming through the dirty window and her stomach cramping so hard she almost cried out. And for a moment, she forgot about the creature until she heard that soft clicking sound and turned her head to see amber eyes watching her with concern. The creature looked slightly better in the daylight, though its injured wing still hung wrong, and the gash on its side looked angry and inflamed, and Katie knew she should probably take it to a vet, except she had exactly $43 left in her wallet and no idea how to explain what this thing was. She pulled herself up and the room spun from hunger, and she grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself and took deep breaths until the dizziness passed. And when she looked back, the creature was trying to stand on shaky legs. Katie found half a bottle of water in her mini fridge and poured some into a bowl and set it near the creature, who drank eagerly and then looked at her with those eyes that seemed to understand far too much. The problem was simple and impossible at the same time, because Katie needed food and the creature needed medical care, and she had no money for either, and her phone had been sold 2 weeks ago to pay rent, which meant she could not even call anyone for help. She made a decision and pulled on her jacket, which was still damp from last night, and told the creature she would be back soon, and somehow she felt like it understood, because it made a soft sound and settled back onto the towel. The pawn shop on the corner was run by an old man who barely looked up when Katie walked in, and she sold her laptop for $80, which was a fraction of what it was worth. But she did not have the luxury of negotiating. And then she went to the convenience store and bought instant ramen and rice and canned soup and a first aid kit that she hoped would work on whatever the creature was. When she got back to her apartment, the creature was exactly where she had left it, and Katie felt relieved in a way that surprised her, because some part of her had worried it would be gone or dead or somehow not real. She cooked rice on her hot plate and ate half and gave the rest to the creature, who consumed it quickly and made that purring sound again. And then Katie opened the first aid kit and looked at the supplies and tried to figure out how to treat a wound on something that should not exist. The creature seemed to understand what she was trying to do and held very still as Katie cleaned the gash with antiseptic, which must have hurt because its whole body went rigid, but it did not pull away or make sounds of complaint. And Katie worked as gently as she could. The wound was deeper than she had thought, and Katie had no idea if she was helping or making things worse, but she bandaged it as best she could, and then looked at the damaged wing and felt helpless because she had no idea how to set a broken bone, especially not one that belonged to a wing. The creature turned its head and looked at its own wing and made a soft trilling sound. And then something impossible happened, because the wing began to glow with a faint light, that started at the base and spread along the bones, and Katie watched with her mouth open as the wing slowly straightened itself and the angle became less wrong. She must have made a sound because the creature looked at her, and she could have sworn it looked amused. And that was when Katie realized that whatever this thing was, it was not just an animal and maybe not even from Earth at all. The days that followed fell into a pattern, and Katie would wake up and share her food with the creature, and then spend hours looking for any kind of work while the creature rested and healed, and she sold everything she owned that had value, including her watch and her winter coat, and the necklace her mother had given her before she died. The creature, which Katie had started calling Ember, because of the way its scales seemed to glow in certain light, grew stronger each day, and its wing moved better and the wound on its side closed faster than should have been possible. And sometimes Katie would catch it watching her with those amber eyes, and she wondered what it was. Thinking one afternoon, Katie came back from another failed job interview and found Ember standing on her mattress with both wings spread wide, and they were magnificent, even in the cramped space of the apartment, and the scales caught the light and threw back colors that did not have names. Ember folded its wings and made a sound that was almost like a question, and Katie sat down heavily on the floor because she was tired and hungry, and the landlord had come by that morning with an eviction. Notice that gave her 2 weeks to pay 3 months of back rent or leave. She did not cry because she had learned that crying solved nothing, but she felt the weight of it all pressing down and wondered how long she could keep going like this, and whether saving Ember had been worth throwing away what little stability she had left. Ember climbed down from the mattress and walked over to Katie and pressed its warm head against her chest right over her heart, and Katie felt something shift inside her like a door opening, and suddenly there were thoughts in her mind that were not her own. The thoughts did not come as words but as feelings and images and understanding, and Katie knew somehow that Ember was trying to communicate, and what Ember was saying was thank you and I see you and debts must be honored. Katie put her hand on Ember's head and felt the warmth of scales under her palm and asked out loud, even though she felt foolish doing it, whether Ember could really understand. The response came not as sound, but as certainty flooding her mind, and it was yes, and more than that because Ember understood everything and had understood from the beginning, and Katie felt tears running down her face, though she could not have said if they were from relief or exhaustion or wonder. That night Ember spoke in her mind again, and the thoughts were clearer now, as if they were both learning a language, and Ember explained things that Katie barely comprehended about distant worlds, and galactic politics, and a title that translated roughly to princess, though it meant something more complex than that. Ember told her about assassins and betrayal and a crash landing on this strange planet where the dominant species was young and curious and mostly harmless, and how Ember had been dying in that alley until Katie had appeared and shared her last meal with a stranger. Katie listened to all of this while lying on her mattress with Ember curled against her side, and tried to process the fact that she had saved an alien princess and wondered what that meant for her future. Ember's thoughts turned sad, and she explained that she could not stay much longer because her people would be looking for her, and every day she remained put Katie in danger from those who had tried to kill her. Katie felt her chest tighten at the thought of Ember leaving, because somehow in just a few weeks, this impossible creature had become the only friend she had in this city, and maybe the only friend she had in the world. But Ember's next thought was firm and clear, and it said that debts must be honored and promises must be kept, and when I return, I will repay what you have given me, because that is the law of my people. And Katie did not understand what that meant, but she felt the certainty behind it. Sleep took them both eventually, and Katie dreamed of stars and ships and worlds she would never see. 3 weeks had passed since Katie found Ember in the rain, and the creature was almost fully healed now, with both wings moving properly, and the wound on its side reduced to a thin line that barely showed under the scales, and Katie knew without being told that their time together was running out. She had sold almost everything she owned by now, and the apartment was nearly empty except for the mattress and the hot plate and a few changes of clothes, and the eviction notice on her door now had a final deadline that was just 4 days away. Katie sat on the floor with her back against the wall and watched Ember practice flying in the small space between the ceiling and the mattress, and the creature moved with grace that seemed impossible, given how badly injured it had been, and she felt proud and sad at the same time. Ember landed next to her and folded its wings carefully, and those amber eyes studied Katie's face with concern, because even without words, Ember could sense her sadness. Katie tried to smile and told Ember not to worry because she would figure something out the way she always did, and maybe she could find a cheaper place or pick up some night shifts somewhere, and her voice sounded hollow, even to her own ears. The truth was that Katie was out of options and out of time, and tomorrow she would need to start looking for a shelter, or maybe try to get a ticket back to the States, where at least she had distant relatives who might let her sleep on their couch. Ember made a low sound that vibrated in its chest and then pressed closer to Katie, and thoughts flooded her mind clearer than they had ever been. And Ember showed her images of vast ships that sailed between stars and cities that floated in space and councils where dozens of different species gathered to make decisions that affected entire sectors of the galaxy. Katie saw through Ember's memories what it meant to be royalty among the draconic sovereignty, and how the assassination attempt had been part of a larger conflict over succession rights, and how Ember had fled through unstable portals to escape and ended up crashing on Earth. She understood now that Ember's people were ancient and powerful, and bound by laws that were older than human civilization, and one of those laws was about debts and how they must be honored, especially debts of life. Ember showed her what would happen next, and Katie's breath caught, because the images were both beautiful and terrifying and involved. Ember leaving but also returning and keeping promises that spanned years or decades. Katie asked out loud whether she would ever see Ember again, and the thought that came back was certain and absolute, and said yes, because debts must be honored, and I will return when I have reclaimed what was taken from me. That night Katie could not sleep, and she lay on the mattress watching Ember's scales shimmer in the darkness, and tried to memorize every detail because she knew this was their last night together. Ember seemed to sense her thoughts and moved closer until they were pressed together, and warmth radiated from the creature's body into Katie's cold limbs, and thoughts flowed between them without effort. Now Katie told Ember through the connection about her own life, and about losing her mother to cancer when she was 19, and about the father who had left before she was born, and about coming to Tokyo with dreams of teaching and making a difference, and how all of those dreams had crumbled. She shared her loneliness and her fear and her desperate hope that things would get better, even though she had no reason to believe they would, and Ember listened to all of it without judgment. When Katie finished, Ember shared something in return, and it was a memory of being young and alone and scared when the assassins first came, and of running and hiding and not knowing who to trust. And Katie realized that despite all their differences, they were not so different. After all, Ember's thoughts turned serious, and she explained that what Katie had done was more than just saving a life, because in draconic culture, sharing your last meal with a stranger was the highest form of hospitality and created a bond that could not be broken. Katie tried to explain that she had not known about any of that and had just done what felt right, but Ember's response was firm and said that intentions mattered, and that Katie had chosen kindness when she had every reason to choose self-preservation. The night grew deeper, and Ember told Katie to remember this moment and remember the promise, because no matter how long it took, Ember would return and would honor the debt. And Katie did not fully understand what that meant, but she believed it anyway. Morning came too soon, and Katie woke to find Ember standing by the window with both wings spread wide, and the early light made the creature's scales look like they were made of liquid gold. She stood up and walked over and put her hand on Ember's neck and felt the pulse of life under the scales, and Ember turned and looked at her one last time with those amber eyes that held stars. The thoughts that came were goodbye and thank you, and remember, and I will return. And then Ember's wings began to glow with light that grew brighter and brighter until Katie had to close her eyes. When the light faded, and Katie opened her eyes again, Ember was gone, and the only sign that the creature had ever been there was a small scale lying on the windowsill that glowed faintly in the morning sun. Katie picked up the scale, and it was warm in her palm, and she could feel a faint vibration like a heartbeat. And somehow she knew that this was Ember's way of leaving a piece of herself behind. She stood at the window for a long time, holding the scale and looking up at the sky and wondering if Ember was already out there somewhere among the stars, or if the journey took longer than that. The eviction notice on her door seemed less important now, though Katie knew she still had to deal with it, and she tucked the scale into her pocket and felt its warmth against her leg, and decided that if Ember could survive assassination attempts and crash landings, then Katie could survive being broke and homeless. She made instant ramen for breakfast and ate it slowly, and tried not to think about how quiet the apartment felt without Ember's presence, and then she got dressed and went out to look for work one more time. The day was long and disappointing, and Katie applied at 7 different places and got rejected at all of them. And by the time she dragged herself back to her apartment, the sun was setting, and she was exhausted. But something had changed inside her, and she could not quite explain it except that knowing Ember had survived and was out there somewhere fighting to reclaim her throne made Katie's own problems seem manageable. She spent the evening packing up what little she had left, and making plans to move to a cheaper neighborhood, and maybe she would have to share an apartment with roommates, and maybe she would have to take a job that was not teaching but she would survive. That night, Katie lay on her mattress and held Ember's scale and felt the warmth pulse against her palm, and she thought about promises and debts and the strange friendship that had formed between a desperate human and an alien princess. She did not know how long it would take for Ember to return or what would happen when she did, but Katie believed in the promise because she had felt the certainty behind it, and that belief was enough to help her sleep. Years would pass and life would continue, and Katie would build something from nothing through sheer determination, but she never forgot the creature she had saved or the promise that had been made. The scale stayed warm in her pocket through everything that came after, and sometimes late at night, Katie would hold it and wonder if Ember could feel her thoughts the way she had felt Ember's, and if somewhere in the vast distance of space a princess remembered the human who shared her last meal with a stranger. 20 years had passed since that rainy night in Tokyo, and Katie Morgan stood behind the counter of her restaurant, watching the evening crowd settle into their tables, and she still found it hard to believe that this place belonged to her. Restaurant was small but successful, and it specialized in comfort food that reminded people of home, and Katie had built it from nothing through years of working 3 jobs and saving every penny, and never giving up even when things seemed impossible. She had left Tokyo eventually and returned to the States and worked as a waitress and then a line cook and then a sous chef, and slowly learned the business until she had enough saved for a small loan and a tiny space in a neighborhood that was just starting to become popular. The scale that Ember had left behind still hung on a chain around Katie's neck, and she had never taken it off in all these years, and sometimes when the restaurant got overwhelming she would touch it and feel the faint warmth and remember that she had once done something that mattered. Most people who saw it thought it was just an unusual piece of jewelry, and Katie never corrected them because how could she explain that it was a gift from an alien princess without sounding insane? Life had gotten better slowly, and then all at once, and Katie had paid off her loans and hired staff and built a reputation for food that was both delicious and affordable, and she made sure that no one who came to her restaurant left hungry even if they could not pay. That policy had cost her money over the years. But Katie remembered what it felt like to be desperate and starving, and she never wanted anyone to experience that, if she could prevent it. The evening rush was winding down when the news alert came through on every phone in the restaurant at the same time, and Katie looked up at the television mounted in the corner and felt her heart stop. The screen showed massive ships appearing in Earth's atmosphere, and they hung in the sky like impossible metal clouds, and the news anchor was trying to maintain composure while reporting that humanity had just made first contact with alien life. Katie's hand went to the scale around her neck, and she felt it, pulse warm against her palm. And somehow she knew that this was connected to Ember, even before the reporter mentioned that the aliens were requesting to speak with world leaders about joining something called the Galactic Council. The restaurant erupted in excited chatter, and people were pulling out phones and calling loved ones, and Katie stood frozen behind her counter, trying to process what was happening. Days passed in a blur of news coverage and speculation, and humanity scrambled to present itself as ready for galactic society, even though everyone knew they were not, and diplomatic teams were formed and scientists gave interviews and the world held its breath. Katie went through her normal routine and cooked food and served customers and tried not to think about the fact that somewhere in those ships Ember might be waiting. 2 weeks after the ships arrived, Katie was closing up the restaurant for the night when she heard a knock on the front door, and she called out that they were closed, but the knocking continued insistent and polite. She walked to the door ready to explain again that the kitchen was shut down, And then she looked through the glass and saw people standing outside who were definitely not human. They wore armor that seemed to be made of living metal that shifted colors in the streetlight, and their faces were obscured by helmets. But Katie could see enough to know they were not from Earth. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door, and one of the figures stepped forward and spoke in perfect English, asking if she was Katie Morgan, who had lived in Tokyo 20 years ago. Katie nodded because her voice did not seem to be working, and the figure stepped aside, and behind them stood someone who made Katie's breath catch. The woman was tall and elegant, with ears that tapered to points and skin that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and she wore robes that shifted between solid and liquid, and her eyes were amber-colored and held the weight of stars. Those eyes met Katie's, and the woman smiled, and it was familiar in a way that made Katie's chest tight. "Hello, Katie," the woman said, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in Katie's bones. "I told you debts must be." Honored Katie's legs felt weak, and she grabbed the doorframe for support and managed to whisper Ember. The woman's smile widened, and she said that Ember was the name Katie had given her, but her true name was Lyra, and she was now Empress of the Draconic Sovereignty, and she had returned to fulfill the promise she made all those years ago. Katie stepped back and let them enter, and the restaurant suddenly felt very small with these otherworldly beings filling the space, and Lyra moved with grace that was both human and not. They sat at one of the tables, and Lyra dismissed her guards, who took positions by the door and windows, and then the Empress looked at Katie with those amber eyes and began to explain. She told Katie about the years after leaving Earth and about fighting her way back to power and defeating the assassins and their allies and claiming the throne that had been meant for her, and it had taken 20 years, but draconic law was absolute, and debts must be honored no matter how long it took. Katie listened and tried to process what she was hearing, and finally asked what Lyra wanted from her, because surely an empress had no need for anything. A simple restaurant owner could provide. Lyra laughed, and it sounded like bells and thunder mixed together, and she said that Katie misunderstood because Lyra was not here to take something, but to give what was owed. The Empress pulled out a tablet covered in symbols that shifted and changed, and explained that humanity was being offered a seat on the Galactic Council and full membership in the greater community. But more than that, Katie herself was being granted status as honored friend of the Draconic Sovereignty. Katie stared at the tablet and asked what that meant, and Lyra explained that it came with lands and titles and wealth beyond measure, and a voice in galactic politics and protection from any who might seek to harm her. The scale around Katie's neck pulsed warm, and she touched it and looked at Lyra, and saw in those amber eyes the same desperate creature she had shared her ramen with all those years ago. Katie took a breath and said that she did not want lands or titles, and Lyra's expression shifted to surprise and interest because this was not the response she had expected. "What do you want then?" Lyra asked, and her voice was genuinely curious. Katie thought about the years of struggle and about the people who had helped her along the way, and about the customers who came to her restaurant, not just for food, but for a place where they felt welcomed and safe. She told Lyra that she wanted resources to feed people the way she had once needed to be fed, and knowledge to help others who were struggling, and the chance to make sure no one had to choose between their own survival and showing kindness to another being. Lyra was silent for a long moment, and then she stood and walked around the table and pulled Katie into an embrace. And Katie felt the warmth of her and smelled something like cinnamon and stars. "This is why I chose correctly," Lyra whispered, and her voice was thick with emotion. "You could have taken wealth and power, but you asked for the ability to help others, and that is exactly what I hoped you would say." They talked long into the night and made plans, and Lyra explained that Katie would have access to draconic technology and resources, and could build a network of places like her restaurant across Earth, and eventually across the galaxy. Katie asked if Lyra would stay, and the Empress shook her head sadly, and explained that she had duties and responsibilities that called her back to the stars, but they would see each other again because the bond they shared transcended distance. Before she left, Lyra placed her hand over the scale that hung around Katie's neck, and it glowed bright for a moment, and the Empress explained that now Katie could call her if needed, and they could speak across the stars the way they had once shared thoughts in that tiny Tokyo apartment. The guards returned and Lyra stood to leave, and Katie walked her to the door and watched as the Empress and her entourage moved down the street toward a transport vehicle that looked like liquid mercury. Lyra turned back one last time and waved, and Katie saw in that gesture the creature who had curled against her for warmth and shared her loneliness. The scale around her neck stayed warm long after the ships had left. The morning after Lyra's visit, Katie woke to find a message on her phone from an unknown number. And when she opened it, the text was written in symbols that shifted and changed until they became readable English, and it contained coordinates and access codes and instructions for a meeting with the Draconic Sovereignty's Earth representatives. She sat on the edge of her bed holding the phone and touching the scale around her neck, and wondering if last night had been real or some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination. But the scale was warmer than it had ever been, and she knew that everything had changed. The meeting location was a building downtown that Katie had passed 100 times without really noticing, and when she arrived, there were people waiting who introduced themselves as ambassadors and trade specialists and cultural liaisons. They led her into a conference room that was bigger than her entire restaurant and showed her plans and projections and possibilities that made her head spin with their scope and complexity. The Draconic Sovereignty wanted to establish what they called compassion centers across Earth and eventually across other developing worlds, and these would be places that provided food and shelter and education and medical care, and Katie would oversee the entire initiative. She tried to explain that she was just a restaurant owner who barely understood how to manage a single location, and they smiled and said that was exactly why. Empress Lyra had chosen her because someone who understood struggle would never forget the people they were trying to help. They showed her technology that could synthesize food from basic organic matter and medical devices that could heal injuries, that human doctors considered impossible, and educational programs that could teach languages and skills in a fraction of the time it normally took. Katie asked what this would cost, and they explained that the Draconic Sovereignty was funding the entire operation as payment for the debt owed to her, and that she would have access to resources that most planetary governments could only dream of. The scale around her neck pulsed, and suddenly Katie heard Lyra's voice in her mind as clear as if the Empress was standing next to her, and the thought said, "Trust them and trust yourself, because you have already proven you know how to help people when it matters most." Katie touched the scale and thought back a question, asking if this was real, and if she was really capable of managing something this large, and Lyra's response was immediate and certain, and said yes, because kindness scales. And what you did for me in that alley, you can do for millions if you choose to. The meeting lasted for hours, and Katie signed documents and reviewed plans and asked questions that the ambassadors answered with patience and respect, and by the time she left, her head was spinning, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She went back to her restaurant and worked the evening shift and told no one about what had happened, because she needed time to process it herself. And that night after closing, she sat at one of the tables and thought about the future. The first Compassion Center opened 3 months later in the same neighborhood where Katie's restaurant stood, and it was a beautiful building that somehow felt both alien and welcoming at the same time. People came cautiously at first because humanity was still adjusting to the reality of alien contact, and some were suspicious of gifts that seemed too good to be true. But Katie was there every day, greeting people and serving food and explaining that this was real, and it was free, and no one would be turned away. Word spread quickly, and soon the center was full every day with people who needed help, and Katie hired staff from the neighborhood and trained them not just in operating the alien technology but in treating every person who walked through the door with dignity and respect. The second center opened 6 months later in a different city, and then a third and a fourth, and Katie found herself traveling constantly between locations and working with local leaders and learning how to manage an organization that was growing faster than she had ever imagined possible. She video called with Lyra whenever she felt overwhelmed, and the Empress would appear on her screen looking regal and amused, and would remind Katie that she had already done the hard part by choosing compassion over self-preservation. All those years ago, humanity's integration into the Galactic Council progressed slowly with debates and negotiations and cultural exchanges, and Katie found herself invited to some of these meetings as the honored friend of the Draconic Sovereignty. She sat in rooms with diplomats and scientists and military leaders and listened to discussions about trade agreements and defense pacts and cultural preservation, and sometimes she would speak up to remind them that all of these grand plans meant nothing. If they forgot about the individuals who were struggling, her voice carried weight. Because she had Lyra's backing and because her compassion centers were becoming a symbol of what positive, alien contact could mean for humanity. 2 years after Lyra's return, Katie stood at the opening ceremony of the 100th Compassion Center and looked out at the crowd of people who had gathered and saw faces from dozens of different backgrounds and circumstances, and she felt something that might have been pride. The scale around her neck pulsed warm, and suddenly Lyra was there, not physically but present in Katie's mind. And the thought that came was, look at what you have built from a single act of kindness. Katie thought back that it was Lyra's resources that had made this possible, and the Empress's response was firm and said resources mean nothing without someone who knows how to use them with wisdom and compassion. That night, Katie returned to her original restaurant, which she had kept open even as the compassion centers expanded, and she cooked dinner for the regular customers who had been coming since the beginning. An older man named Frank, who had been homeless when he first started coming to her restaurant 5 years ago, sat at the counter and told Katie that he had heard she was doing big things with aliens and important people. Katie smiled and said she was just trying to help people the way others had helped. Her and Frank laughed and said that was the most Katie answer she could have given. She closed up late and walked home through streets that felt safer than they used to, and looked up at the sky where somewhere among those stars Lyra was probably dealing with her own complicated problems. The scale pulsed, and Katie sent a thought out into the universe saying, "Thank you for keeping your promise," and she felt rather than heard Lyra's response, which was, "Thank you for giving me something worth." Returning for 3 years after first contact, humanity was still adjusting, but things were getting better slowly, and the compassion centers had expanded to other countries, and Katie had trained hundreds of managers who shared her philosophy of dignified assistance. She received offers to enter politics and to join corporate boards and to become a celebrity spokesperson, but she turned them all down because her work was in the centers and with the people who needed help. Lyra visited Earth twice more, and each time she made sure to spend at least one evening at Katie's original restaurant, where they would sit and talk and remember the rainy night in Tokyo that had changed both their lives. During the second visit, Lyra told Katie that the Draconic Sovereignty was starting similar programs on other worlds and using the compassion centers as a model, and Katie felt overwhelmed by the idea that her work was spreading across the galaxy. The Empress smiled and said that this was how debts were truly honored, not just by giving wealth or status, but by creating something that would outlast both of them and help people. They would never meet. Katie asked if the debt was paid now, and Lyra laughed and said that technically, yes, the debt was settled, but what they had was no longer about obligation, and Katie understood that somewhere along the way the debt had transformed into friendship. Years continued to pass, and Katie's hair started to gray, and her body started to feel the effects of decades of hard work. But the compassion centers continued to grow and evolve and help people across Earth and beyond. She never forgot the desperation she had felt in that Tokyo alley, or the choice she had made to share her last meal with a stranger, and every time she saw someone walk into a compassion center with that same desperate hope in their eyes, she remembered why all of this mattered. The scale around her neck never stopped being warm, and Katie knew that across the vast distance of space Lyra could feel her thoughts and was probably smiling. One evening, Katie stood at the window of her apartment and looked up at the stars, and thought about how one small act of kindness had rippled out to change the galaxy, and wondered what other small acts were happening right now that would shape the future in ways no one could predict. She touched the scale and sent a final thought to Lyra, saying that she was grateful not just for the resources and opportunities, but for the friendship and for proving that kindness was never wasted. The response came back warm and certain, and said, "The gratitude is mutual. My friend, and debts may be honored, but friendship is forever." And Katie smiled and thought that was a pretty good way to end the story.